first saw Alcatraz through a slit of fog thick enough to swallow a ship whole. The boat rocked beneath us. Me, a few guards, a few prisoners who kept their heads down as if staring at the island too long might break them. People said nobody escapes the rock, and when you see that jagged stone rising out of the bay like a shark tooth, you understand why. My cuffs were cold, the wind colder, but I didn't shiver. I'd been locked up before. Still, this place felt different, permanent. They gave me cell B-144, barely wide enough to stretch my arms. Metal bed, thin blanket, cold sink, and a toilet that roared like machinery. A few months later, my brother Clarence arrived. We still weren't cell neighbors, but we'd see each other in the meal line and trade a quiet word. We'd spent most of our lives side by side. Odd jobs, long roads, and eventually the robberies that put our names on the wrong lists. Clarence was steady, smarter than he ever let on, and loyal in a way only a brother could be. When the jobs got bigger and the heat got worse, the feds decided we were better off in a place no one walked away from. If Clarence was close, I felt like I still had a piece of the world with me. Then came Frank Morris. Sharp eyes, quiet voice, always studying everything. He played the harmonica softly, like the music was meant only for him. People said he had one of the highest IQs the feds had ever tested, and I believed it from the way he watched the guards' patterns. And Alan West, talkative, restless, always trying to lighten the mood. Behind the noise was a sharp mind that noticed things most men ignored. West was the first to realize this place wasn't as perfect as the guards believed. The four of us came together slowly, a nod in the yard, a shared comment in the workshop, a glance when a guard's back turned, until one day West leaned close during work detail and whispered, "John, I found something." He wasn't lying. Behind his sink, buried under peeling paint, West had found a patch of concrete so rotten you could push a thumb into it. Years of damp air from the vent behind it had eaten the wall from inside out. West grinned like he'd struck gold. "This place isn't as solid as they think." At first, it didn't mean much to me. A weak wall doesn't make an escape. It just makes trouble. But West wasn't talking about a hole. He was talking about a hidden utility corridor running behind our cells. He told Frank next. Frank didn't react, just studied that crumbling patch like he already saw the map laid out. Then he said, quiet and certain, "We'll need tools." That was the moment everything shifted. Not because we'd chosen to escape, but because I realized these men weren't dreaming. They were planning. And once you start imagining the impossible, it refuses to leave your mind. The tools didn't come in a day. We snagged spoons from the cafeteria, one at a time. Took metal clips off mop handles. I tore apart an old vacuum motor. Frank turned its guts into a crude drill. Then came the nights. Lights out. Silence. I'd reach behind the sink, touch the cold wall and start scraping. Scrape. 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 Hours of work until my fingers burned and dust caked my throat. But the hole widened. Tiny victories, stolen inches. To hide the noise, we built a rhythm of distractions. I tapped lightly on my bars. Clarence tapped back. Frank coughed or played a soft harmonica note. Noise covering noise. West had a nervous energy he couldn't hide. He talked more than he should. Not about the plan, but enough to make me uneasy. I kept warning him to stay quiet, but silence just wasn't in his nature. Digging the holes was only half the job. If we slipped out, someone still had to be lying in our beds during count. That meant building dummy heads, and they had to be good enough to fool a guard from a few feet away. We carved them from stolen soap mixed with wet toilet paper, shaped the faces with our thumbs, let them dry, painted them with flesh tones from the art room. The hair came from the barbershop floor. I glued it on strand by strand. One night, staring at that half-finished head, I thought, this is what disappearing looks like. But it wasn't the dummy itself that made escape real. It was the commitment behind it. By then, all of us were too deep to turn back. Once the holes opened, the prison revealed its hidden side. Behind our cells was a forgotten utility corridor, dark, dusty, roaring with fan noise. The first time I squeezed through, the air hit me like rust and metal. We learned that space inch by inch, tested pipes, walkways, shadowed corners the guards never checked. Then came the bigger question. How do you leave the island? Frank studied guard rotations. Clarence watched the shoreline during yard time. I tracked the currents by watching where floating scraps drifted. Then Frank said it. A raft. Not wood. Raincoats. So we started stealing them, one here, one there, until we had more than 50. We glued them using heat from the steam pipes. The seams melted tight, turning cloth into thick, rubbery skin. West bragged he'd solved the last problem, how to inflate it. An accordion pump. Simple, crazy idea, but it worked. By early June 1962, everything was in place. The holes were nearly cut. The raft waited in the crawl space. The dummy heads were finished. And the route, every shadow, every ladder, every timing was memorized. None of us said it, but we all felt it. The moment was close. June 11th arrived heavy. The air in the block felt different, like the prison sensed what we were about to attempt. I slid the dummy head under my blanket, shaped the covers just right, and crouched by the sink. If I crawled out, that was the end of John Anglin, inmate of Alcatraz. I tapped lightly. Clarence tapped back. Frank tapped twice. West didn't tap. I waited, seconds that felt far longer. Told myself he was being careful. Then I went for the hole. The concrete scraped my shoulders as I slipped into the narrow corridor behind the cells. Darkness swallowed everything except the roar of the fans. Frank joined me, then Clarence. I waited for West's hands to appear, but the opening stayed empty. "Alan," I whispered. Nothing. Frank looked at me through the dark, calculating the seconds. Seconds we didn't have. I whispered to Morris. We must wait for him. But waiting wasn't an option. Not tonight. If a guard stepped toward our cells, the whole plan collapsed. I pressed my forehead to the metal and whispered, "I'm sorry, Alan." Then I turned away and followed Frank and Clarence deeper into the dark, toward the roof, toward the water, toward whatever came next. We climbed the pipes like we'd practiced for months. Quiet, steady. Reaching the top grate, I realized how much depended on luck. The bolts were rusted, weak, but would they give? Frank wedged his tool under the first one. A soft crack. It fell. The second was stubborn. Frank twisted harder. Crack. 2 more bolts. 2 more cracks. We pushed the grate aside and crawled into the roof shaft. The air was sharp and cold. The wind whistled between the metal edges. We stayed low, crossing toward the northeast corner, the one blind spot where the guards' lights couldn't reach. The drop to the ground was risky. We used a vent pipe, slid down in turns, waited for patrol, then crossed the yard shadows to the shoreline. And there it was, our raft, folded, heavy, real. No turning back now. The waves slapped the rocks hard, spraying cold water across my face. My fingers went numb, dragging the raft into the shallows. Clarence held the pump. Frank sealed the valves. I kept watch for movement on the road above. The bay was a monster that night. Wind cutting, current dragging toward the Golden Gate. Once the raft inflated, we pushed it into the water. It bobbed once, twice, then steadied. "John," Clarence said quietly. A warning. This was our only shot. We climbed in. The water numbed my legs instantly. Frank paddled with his improvised oars. Clarence took the rear. I took the front. Alcatraz shrank behind us. Slow at first, then faster as the current pulled us into the dark. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Halfway across, a wave slammed into the raft, nearly flipping us. Clarence shouted for me to hold on. Another wave, then another. But the raft held. The seams stayed tight. The raincoat skin didn't tear. We paddled until our arms felt like they'd break, until the wind eased, until the prison lights faded into memory. Then, land. A silhouette, a dark shape ahead. Close. We steered toward it with the last of our strength. When the raft finally scraped onto shore, sand or rock, I don't remember, I fell forward, crawling onto the cold ground, gasping like I'd surfaced from the dead. Clarence collapsed beside me. Frank stayed silent, looking back toward the water. None of us said, "Free." Not yet, but we had done the impossible. We had left the rock, and the world would spend decades wondering what happened next.
By the next morning, Alcatraz woke to the one thing the rock swore could never happen: a missing inmate. During the routine count, everything looked normal, until a guard touched the pillow and the dummy head rolled onto the floor. Panic spread instantly. Alarms echoed across the island. By sunrise, the FBI, Coast Guard, and prison officials had launched one of the biggest manhunts the Bay had ever seen. Boats swept the freezing water. Helicopters searched the shoreline. Divers fought the same deadly currents the warden insisted no man could survive. But nothing was found. No bodies, no raft, no sign of 3 men in the dark. Officially, the government called it a drowning. But the years that followed told a different story. That same night, a blue Chevrolet was reported speeding away from a shoreline near the spot Alan West said the men planned to reach. Seen by a passerby just after midnight. Never officially linked, but never forgotten. In the late 1970s, the Anglin family released a photo said to be taken in Brazil. 2 men by a riverbank who looked strikingly like John and Clarence. Analysts called the similarity likely. The FBI called it inconclusive. Then came the 2013 letter. Someone claiming to be John Anglin wrote that he survived the escape, lived under a false identity, and was dying. The FBI tested the letter and couldn't confirm it, or rule it out. To this day, the fate of John Anglin, Clarence Anglin, and Frank Morris remains one of America's greatest mysteries. No bodies were ever found. No proof ever surfaced. But one thing is certain. They challenged the rock, and the world still can't decide whether the Bay claimed them or whether they escaped into legend. The prison itself had been shuttered on March 21, 1963. Not because of the escape, but because operating the isolated island was 3 times more expensive than any other federal penitentiary. Years later, in 2025, a government plan emerged to reopen the site as a working prison again.